I was 9 years old, and I had been carrying the same letter for 3 days. It lived in the inside pocket of my gray coat, over my ribs, folded twice, and it had gone soft at the creases from being taken out and looked at and put back. 3 mornings I had walked the length of the west gallery to the door of my grandmother's rose study. 3 mornings I had got as far as the latch and no farther. On the first morning I caught my hem on the iron of the doorplate and tore it, a ragged little mouth of gray thread, 4 inches above the ankle, that my nurse had not yet noticed, and that I had not yet confessed. On the second morning I did not even touch the latch. I stood in front of the door with my hands behind my back, the way I had seen my father stand at reviews, and I told myself that a princess of Eldermore did not hesitate, and then I hesitated for 11 minutes and went away. On the third morning, there was a guardsman at the door. I want to say, all these years later, that I understood what I was carrying. I did not. I was 9. I knew that the letter was wrong the way you know a note is wrong when someone plays it on a piano, not by any argument but in the teeth. I knew that I had been told to put it somewhere and told not to say. I knew that the not saying had become a weight I could feel in my chest when I breathed in, and that it had begun to make me clumsy and sulky and strange, and that my brother Torin had asked me twice what was the matter with me, and I had told him nothing was, which was my first lie and did not feel like my last. And I knew that if I did what I had been told to do, I would never be able to undo it. That is a great deal for 9 to hold. So I stood in the west gallery on the third morning, in the long gray light off the river, with my torn hem and my soft letter, and I looked at the guardsman standing at my grandmother's door, and I hated him, briefly and unfairly, for being in the way. His name was Merrick Dunne. He was 29 years old, and he had been 3 years in the household guard, and the post he was standing that morning was the one the second company called the dead post. The rose study door, on the north side of the west gallery, second floor, a door that nobody opened. My grandmother had died there. Not in the room in the end, but it was her room, her chair, her writing box, her tall window with the sill she had worn smooth with her elbows, and when she died my grandfather had ordered it closed and kept exactly as she had left it. There was a fire laid in the grate that would never be lit. There was a book face down on the arm of a chair with her place in it, and the place would never be found again by the woman who had made it. A guard stood there day and night. It was ceremonial, and it was pointless, and it was, they all agreed, the worst duty in the palace, because nothing ever happened at the rose study door and nothing ever would, and a man could stand there for 4 hours in the pale river light and feel his own life going by on the other side of the wall. Merrick Dunne had stood it 11 times that season. He liked it. I did not learn that until much later. He liked it because it was a door that did not want anything from him, and because his mother had spent her whole life in rooms she was not allowed to sit down in, and it pleased him, in a way he could not have explained to anyone in the mess, to be trusted with a room that mattered to no one but a dead woman and an old king. And because he liked it, and because he was the sort of man who counted things, he had noticed me. He had noticed me on the first morning, a small figure at the far end of the gallery who came halfway and stopped. He had noticed the tear in my hem when I finally came close enough to be noticed, and he had noticed that it was fresh, and that I kept putting my hand over it. He had noticed that I came at the same hour, which meant I was skipping something, as it happened, the half hour after my lesson and before my walk, the one crack in a 9-year-old's day wide enough to fall through. He had noticed that I stood in front of a door I had no reason on earth to open. And on the third morning he noticed that I was holding something inside my coat, with both hands, the way you hold something hot. He noticed all of it and he said nothing, because a guardsman of the household does not speak to the royal family. He does not address them, he does not question them, he does not remark upon their hems. That is not a preference. It is a standing order, printed and posted, and he had signed the book that said he had read it. And besides the general order there was a particular one, laid down 4 months earlier over the signature of Halbert Slay, controller of the household. The rose study is closed by the king's wish. No person enters. The sentry will not engage. Will not engage. 2 words, and they were the 2 words standing between me and the rest of my life, and I did not know it, and neither did he. Let me tell you what was in the letter, since you will want to know, and since I have spent 21 years learning to tell this part plainly. My grandmother was Queen Isolde, and she was dead. She had been dead a year and 8 months. My grandfather, King Alaric, had married again 14 months after that, which the realm thought too soon and said so quietly in the way realms do. And the woman he married was Morwenna, and she was queen consort, and she was the most charming person who has ever wished me harm. I want to be precise, because precision is the only kindness I can offer to that year. Morwenna never raised her voice to me. She never laid a hand on me. She never frightened me, and no one ever hurt me, and I say that first because when people hear the beginning of this story they lean forward with a particular look on their faces, and I would rather take that look off them at once. Nothing was done to me. Something was asked of me. That is the whole of it, and it turned out to be quite enough. What Morwenna wanted was Larkspur. My grandmother had come to Eldermore from the Valemark coast with a great deal of her own, and she had kept it her own, which is not usual, and which she had insisted on with a firmness that people who did not like her called foreign. Larkspur House, with its beech avenue and its 1,100 acres and its library of 40,000 books. The Isolde jewels, which were hers and not the crown's, bought with her own money and her mother's before her. A yearly income out of the Valemark shipping that would have run a small county. And 2 years before she died, being ill and being clear-headed, she had gathered all of it into a single instrument and settled it, every stone, every acre, every book upon me. The Isolde Settlement, drawn by 4 lawyers and witnessed by 7, to be held in trust and to be mine outright on my 18th birthday. Not on my father's, not on the crown's, mine. I have often wondered whether she did it because she loved me, or because she had already taken a hard look at the future and did not like the shape of it. I have decided it was both, and that this is not a contradiction, and that the difference between a sentimental woman and a formidable one is that the formidable one gets it in writing. The settlement could not simply be broken. Lawyers had made sure of that. It was the most heavily fortified document in the realm. There was, however, one door left in the wall, because there always is. If it could be shown by clear evidence in the late Queen's own hand that she had made the settlement in error or in illness, and had afterwards wished it undone, then the court of the justiciar might set it aside and return the whole estate to the crown's discretion, to be disposed of as the king saw fit. And the king, in that year, saw very largely as his wife told him to. So there needed to be a letter, in my grandmother's hand, on my grandmother's paper, under my grandmother's seal. A letter from a dying woman to her husband, saying that she had been muddled and frightened when she signed, that she had wanted only to be kind and had ended by being foolish, that a child of 9 should not be made the richest woman in Eldermore, and that she trusted him to undo what she had done, and to put the whole of it into the hands of the good work his new wife would surely one day take up. They wrote it well. I have read it since. I have read it perhaps 200 times, which is a thing I try not to think about too closely, and it is a beautiful piece of writing. It sounds like a tired woman being brave. It has a small joke in it about the beech avenue. It has one line so exactly like her that when it was read aloud, months later, in front of the whole court, my grandfather put his hand flat on the table and had to be helped to sit. And it needed to be found, not produced, not handed over by a clerk, not discovered in the consort's own papers, not brought forward by anybody who stood to gain. A letter like that, appearing out of Morwenna's household, would have been sniffed at by every lawyer in the realm and shredded in a week. It had to come out of the one place no honest man could question, out of my grandmother's own writing box, in my grandmother's own closed room, in front of witnesses, on the day the room was opened. The room was opened once a year. On the remembrance of Queen Isolde in the last week of Ash month, the king and the family and the keeper of the queen's papers went up to the rose study, and the fire was not lit and the book was not moved, and my grandfather stood at the window for a while, and then they all came down again. It was the saddest hour of the year, and it was, from a certain point of view, an opportunity. And the letter had to be found by somebody, whose finding it nobody would ever doubt. There was only one person in the palace who could not possibly be suspected of forging her own grandmother's last wish and planting it in her own grandmother's desk in order to disinherit herself. That was me. 2 days before the third morning, Morwenna had sent for me to the amber room. She had a way of sending for you that did not feel like being sent for. A footman would find you and say the queen wondered whether you were free, which of course you were, and when you arrived she would already be doing something, arranging flowers or reading or writing at the little desk by the fire, and she would look up as if you had surprised her with a gift. She had cocoa waiting. She always did. She asked me about my lessons, and she listened to the answer which most adults did not. She said my hair was doing something clever that day. And then she said, in exactly the voice she had used for the hair, "Malin, I've found something of your grandmother's, and I don't quite know what to do with it, and I think you're old enough to help me." I remember the pull of that. Old enough to help. I would have carried a cathedral across the river for whoever said it to me first. She took the letter out of the desk and she unfolded it and she let me look. Not a glance, she let me look, for a long minute, holding it in her own hands, tilting it to the fire. I saw the pale gray paper with the Wheatsheaf watermark. I saw the sloping, hurrying hand. I saw the name at the bottom. Isolde R. And I saw that there was no bird. I need to explain the bird, and I need you to understand that this is not a charming detail. It is the hinge of everything that follows. My grandmother taught me to write. Not my governess, my grandmother, at the long table in the rose study, with a nib that spat and a pot of ink she would not let anyone move because it was where it was. And on the day I first managed to write my own name without help, she took the paper from me and drew something beside my signature, a small bird, 3 strokes, a body and a beak and a tail. A wren. "There," she said, "now it's really yours." And she showed me that she did the same. Every letter she had ever written me, and there were a great many because she wrote to me from Larkspur every week of every summer of my life, every one of them had the wren beside the name. 3 strokes, a body and a beak and a tail. I asked her once why she did it, because I was 6 and I asked everything. She said, because anybody can copy a name, my wren. Nobody can copy a bird. She was smiling when she said it. But she said it, and she meant it, and she was a woman who had lived 30 years in that palace, and she had a very clear idea of what people were capable of. So I stood in the amber room with a cup of cocoa going cold at my elbow, looking at a letter in my grandmother's hand, with my grandmother's name at the bottom of it, and no bird. And Morwenna said, it should be where she meant it to be, shouldn't it? In her own box in her own room, and your grandfather should find it there on her day and not have it thrust at him by me, because he doesn't always believe things that come from me, and I don't blame him. She said that. She said it with a small, rueful, disarming laugh. It was the most skillful sentence I have ever heard spoken. "So you shall put it back," she said. "And on the remembrance, when he opens the box, you shall be the one to lift it out and give it to him. And it will come to him from her, through you, and that is exactly right." Then she took a wafer of violet wax and a candle, and she took a small silver thing out of the desk drawer, and she put it into my hand, a seal matrix, heavy for its size, with a worn handle of dark horn and a face cut with the interlaced eye and the crown that had been my grandmother's private cipher. "You may seal it yourself," she said, "with her own seal as she would have. Would you like that?" And God forgive me, I said yes. I lit the wax with the candle. I let it fall, and I pressed the silver face into it, and I made my grandmother's mark on a lie with my own hand at 9 years old, while a woman stood over me with her hand warm on my shoulder telling me how nicely I had done it. "Now," she said, folding my fingers around the letter, "this is ours. Not a word, not to anyone, not to your father, not to Torin, not to your nurse. If you tell, it will all come out flat and clumsy and be spoiled, and your grandfather will have to be told there was a surprise, and there is nothing sadder in the world than a surprise that has been explained. You do see." I saw, that is the thing about 9. You see the shape of what you are shown, and the shape she showed me was a kindness. I kept the letter. I kept the seal too, because she never asked for it back, and I put it in my coat pocket with the letter, and I have thought about that ever since, that she did not ask for it back. Perhaps she forgot. Perhaps she had a great many things to think of. Perhaps a woman that clever simply could not conceive that the small silver object she had put into a small hand would one day be the thing that finished her. I did not sleep well for 2 nights. On the 3rd morning I went to the rose study door to do as I was told, and there was a guardsman standing at it, and I stopped in the middle of the gallery like a horse at a gate. And Merrick Dunne, who had orders not to speak, and who had counted 3 mornings and 1 torn hem and 2 hands holding something hot, looked at me for the length of 4 breaths. Then he came off the door. Not far. 1 step and down onto 1 knee, so that his eyes were below mine, which I did not understand at the time and have understood every day since, with his rifle grounded and his gloved hand flat on the stock. And he asked me a question. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not ask what I was hiding, or who had sent me, or why I was crying because I was not crying. He asked the smallest, quietest, least alarming question a grown man has ever asked me, and he asked it the way you would ask a stranger the time. "Is it yours, Highness?" That was all. 4 words and my title. He was not looking at my face. He was looking, without pointing, at the corner of gray paper showing at the edge of my coat, where my hands had stopped being careful. I have been asked a great many questions since. I have been asked them by lawyers, by ministers, by 3 separate boards of inquiry, and by a man who was later hanged for something entirely unconnected. I have never in my life wanted to answer anything as much as I wanted to answer that. "No," I said. And then, because the not saying had been sitting on my chest for 3 days, and because a door had opened in it and I could not stop, the whole of it came out of me at once, in the wrong order, in one breath, the way a jug empties. "No. It's grandmother's, except it isn't, because it hasn't got the bird. The Queen gave it to me. She said to put it in grandmother's box and find it again on Remembrance Day and never say where it came from." Then I stood there with my mouth open and my heart going like a drum, appalled at myself, waiting to be told I had spoiled everything. Merrick Dunne did not move. He has told me since, years later, when we could both talk about it, that his first thought was not about forgery, or the settlement, or Morwenna, or any of the things a clever man would have leapt to. His first thought was, she has been holding that for days and nobody asked her. His second thought was that he was a guardsman on a closed post, alone in a gallery with a princess of the blood, in flat and unarguable breach of a written order, and that whatever he did in the next 90 seconds would very probably end his career. His third thought was his mother. I will put her here because he would want me to, and because she is the reason there is a story at all. Her name was Isolde Dunne, and she was a laundress in a great house in the northern shires, and when Merrick was 11 a silver dish went missing and it was said that she had taken it. She had not. She was turned out of the house in a February without a character, which in that county in that year meant she would not work again. And she did not. And she died 9 years later in a lodging by the canal, having never once been permitted to say, to any person with the power to hear it, "I did not take the dish." Nobody asked her. That was what he could not get past all his life. Not the accusation, the silence around it. 4 rooms of people who had known her 20 years, and not one of them had turned to her and said, plainly, *odd, is it yours? He had joined the household guard at 19 for reasons he could not have defended in an argument. Something about standing where you are put and not moving off it. He had spent 10 years learning to be a man who did not speak. And he was, that morning, a man who had spent 11 watches at a dead door thinking about a woman who was never asked. So he had asked. He would say afterwards at the inquiry when they pressed him on it, and the lying got into the newspapers and out of them and into the regiment, where it is still said, "My orders said the door was not to be opened, sir. They said nothing about the girl in front of it." He stayed on his knee. He did not take the letter from me. That, too, mattered more than either of us knew. "Highness," he said, "may I ask you 2 more things, and then I will not ask you anything again?" I nodded. "Have you opened it?" She opened it, I looked at it, then I sealed it. Something happened in his face at that, and was put away. "And do you have anything else of hers, of the Queen Consort's?" I put my hand in my pocket and brought out the seal. He looked at it lying in my palm, the dark horn handle, the worn silver face, for perhaps 3 seconds. And then he did the thing that I think of now, as the moment the whole business was actually decided, though nothing visible happened at all. He put his hands behind his back. "Highness," he said, "I am not going to touch either of those, not the letter, not the seal. Do you understand why?" I said no. "Because," he said, "if a guardsman is the last person to hold a thing, then in a month's time somebody in a good coat will stand up and say that the guardsman put something in it, or took something out of it, or made the whole of it up because he wanted to be interesting. And they will be believed, because that is how it goes. So I am not going to touch them. You are going to keep holding them. And you and I are going to walk in the open down the middle of this gallery, past every footman and every clock, to the one office in this palace, whose business it is to hold the Queen's papers. And you are going to hand them across the counter yourself, in front of witnesses, and take a receipt." I said, "But I'm not allowed to tell anyone." He was quiet for a moment. "Highness," he said, "were you told not to tell, or were you told it would spoil a surprise?" I thought about it, and I remember exactly the cold feeling of the ground moving under those 2 things being different. "The second one," I said. "Then there isn't any surprise," said Merrick Dunne. "And there never was, and I am very sorry, and none of it is your fault, and I need you to walk beside me now." He stood. He picked up his rifle. He turned his head and said, without raising his voice, "Sergeant," and 40 feet away at the gallery's end Sergeant Nan Orick, who was on the through patrol and who had been watching this in disbelief for the better part of a minute, came up at the march. "I am off my post," Dunne said to her. "Log the time, log that I spoke first. Log every word of it that you heard, and log that I did not lay a hand on Her Highness or on anything she is carrying." Nan Orick was 36, had 11 years in, and had a face like a closed drawer. "Merrick," she said, "what have you done?" "I asked a question," he said. "God help you," said Nan Orick, and fell in on my other side. We walked the West Gallery. I have walked it 1,000 times since, and I have walked it in front of foreign heads of state, and I have never walked it the way I walked it that morning. On the left of a guardsman in full order, with a sergeant on my right, holding a folded letter in both hands out in front of me like a plate I was afraid of dropping, past the long windows and the river light and every startled footman in Harrogate. We passed under the clock at the stairhead. Dunne said, "Note the hour, Sergeant." "Noted," said Orick, 22 minutes past 10. We passed a housemaid with an armful of linen who stopped dead. We passed 2 clerks of the controller's office who did not stop, and who looked, and who kept walking rather too fast in the direction we had come from. Dunne watched them go. "That's the hour gone," he said quietly to Orick. "That's the hour gone," she agreed. "The office of the Queen's papers is in the base of the North Tower, at the end of a corridor that smells of vellum and cold stone, behind a counter of black oak with a brass grill. It is not a grand office. It is one of the oldest in the household, older than the controllers, older than the chancery, and its business is very narrow. It holds, indexes, and produces the private papers of the Queens of Eldermore, and it answers to the Crown and to no one else in the building. It had been held for 19 years by a woman called Isolde Sedge. Mistress Sedge was 61 and small, and wore spectacles on a chain, and had the flat, unhurried, unimpressible manner of somebody who has spent 19 years being lied to by important people. She looked at me. She looked at the guardsman and the sergeant. She looked at the letter in my hands. "Your Highness," she said, "how may the office serve you?" And Merrick Dunne, who could very easily have answered for me, and whose whole life would have been simpler if he had, said nothing at all. So I said it myself. I said it badly and twice over, and I got the days muddled, and Mistress Sedge did not once interrupt me or help me or finish a sentence for me. She let me get there. When I had finished, she said, "Do you wish to deposit these items with this office, Highness?" I said I did. "Then place them on the counter yourself, please, and not into my hand." I did. She did an extraordinary thing then, which I did not understand for years. She did not pick the letter up. She rang a bell and a clerk came and she said, "Fetch Mr. Cray and Mr. Hollins from the rolls and bring the day book and the glass and the ledger, and do not tell anybody in the controller's office where you are going." And when the two men came, she made all 5 of them, the 2 clerks, the 2 guards, and herself sign, one after another, in a bound ledger with numbered pages, the plain fact of what was on her counter in whose presence, and at what time. Then, with the glass, in front of all of them, she looked at the letter for a long while without touching it. Then she looked at the seal. Then she took off her spectacles, and I saw her hands were not quite steady, and she said, to nobody in particular, "6 weeks ago this office issued that matrix on a requisition. It has not been returned. The requisition is in the book." "Whose hand?" said Dunne. Mistress Sedge put her spectacles back on. "Guardsman," she said, "I am not going to say that out loud in a corridor. I am going to write it down and lock it up and take it to the only people in this house who can do anything with it. And you are going to go back to your post and stand there and say nothing to anybody, and so is your sergeant. And if either of you is asked, you will say you escorted a member of the royal family who wished to visit this office, which is the truth." "Ma'am," said Dunne. "Guardsman," she stopped him at the door, "who spoke first? You or Her Highness?" "I did, ma'am." "Then you have broken an order." "Yes, ma'am." "Yes," said Isolde Sedge, and wrote something in the ledger. "Well, so did the Queen who built this office twice, and the realm is still standing." I did not go back to my lessons. I went and sat on the end of my bed with my coat still on and my torn hem hanging, and I was sick, and then I was hungry, and then I fell asleep in the middle of the afternoon like a much younger child, and when I woke my nurse was sitting beside me and did not say anything at all about where I had been, which is how I knew that everybody in the palace already did. They took 11 days to come for him. That is the part people always get wrong when the story is told. They expect thunder, the queen consort denounced by lunchtime, the guardsmen carried on shoulders. There was no thunder. There was an office in a tower with a locked ledger, and a woman waiting for a word with the king, and the king away 4 days at the naval yards. And in that quiet, a machine that had been running very smoothly for a long time noticed a grain of grit and began, without hurry, to grind it out. It began with Captain Ansel Bray. Bray commanded the 2nd Company. He was 44, a plain, dry, decent officer who had been passed over twice and expected to be passed over again, and Dunne reported to him that same evening, standing to attention in the company office with his cap under his arm, and told him the entire thing in 9 minutes without embellishment. Bray listened, then he sat for a while looking at his own hands. Dunne, he said, you understand what you have just handed me. I think so, sir. You have not, said Bray. You have handed me a written order over the controller's signature, which you disobeyed in the presence of a child of the royal family on a closed post. That is what I have. That is what exists on paper. Everything else you have told me is your account of a conversation for which there is one witness, who is 9. Sergeant Orrick heard the last of it, sir. Sergeant Orrick heard a guardsman speaking to a princess, Bray said. Which is the offense? He got up and stood at the window for a while. I'll write it up, he said at last, properly. Everything in order with the Times and Orrick's statement, and I'll send it up tonight, and I'll send a copy to the adjutant and keep a copy in this drawer. Sir? Done, Bray turned round. You could have gone back on your post and said nothing and no one would ever have known. Why didn't you? And Dunne, who had been standing at attention for 12 minutes, and would go on standing at attention for another 4, said, because she was going to do it, sir. She had her hand on the latch, and she'd have been the one who found it, and she'd have carried it to her grandfather with her own hands, and she'd have gone on believing for the rest of her life that she'd done a kind thing. Bray looked at him. Get out, he said, not unkindly. The report went up that night. It went, because the chain of command in the household ran that way, and there was no other way for it to go, through the office of the controller of the household. Halbert Slay read it at 7:09 the following morning. By noon it had been, in the language of the household, referred, which meant it had gone into a drawer. And at 4 o'clock a runner came down to the 2nd Company's orderly room with a routine rotation of duties, effective immediately, and Guardsman Merrick Dunne was taken off the Rose Study post and sent to the outer gate, where he stood for the next 6 days in the rain, in front of a crowd of tourists with cameras, watching the carriages of a household that had just discovered him. I have wondered since what Morwenna felt in the hour she found out. I have decided she felt nothing much. She was not a woman who panicked. She was a woman who replanned. She had built the whole thing on a child's silence, and the child had not been silent, and so the child's speech would have to be made into a building material instead. That was all. It is the mark of the truly dangerous that they can lose the ground under them and simply begin walking on the air. Her first move was not against Dunne. It was against nothing at all. She did precisely, ostentatiously, visibly nothing for 4 days, while the king was at the naval yards and Mistress Sedge sat on a locked ledger waiting for him. Her second move was to be lovely to me. She came to the schoolroom, which she had never once done. She brought Bram a wooden boat, and she was funny with Torrin, who was 11 and susceptible, and she sat down on the low bench that is made for 9-year-olds and got her skirts creased on it, and she said, in front of the governess and the nurse and my 2 brothers, Malin, I've been so worried about you. I hear you took your grandmother's letter to the paper's office all by yourself. That was exactly right. I ought to have thought of it myself, and I didn't, and I'm ashamed. And she smiled at me, and she has never before or since been more frightening. Because do you see what she had just done? In 11 words, in front of 5 witnesses, she had made herself the person who approved of the letter going to the paper's office. She had taken the one act that was supposed to destroy her and stood behind it, nodding. And she had left me 9, honest, hopelessly outclassed, with nothing to say but the truth, which now sounded, even in my own ears, like something I had made up. You told me not to tell, I said. I told you it was a lovely secret, she said gently. And it was a silly thing for me to say, and you were quite right not to keep it, and if I frightened you, I am truly sorry. She put her hand out and touched my hair. You have such a serious little face. Don't carry things about, my love. Give them to grown-ups. Then she left, and Torrin said, She's not so bad, and I went out into the passage and put my forehead on the cold wall. That was the day I stopped being a child who had done something brave and became a child who was being managed *, and I could feel it happening and could not name it. and that is a very particular kind of loneliness which I would not wish on anyone. Her third move was Halbert Slay. The controller of the household was a long, gray, courteous man of 50 who had the whole physical machinery of Harrogate in his hands. The appointments, the rotas, the keys, the stores, the requisition books, and who had, over 16 years, made himself the person through whom every piece of paper in the palace had to pass on its way to becoming a fact. He had been the late Queen's servant, and then the King's, and then, quite quickly, Morwenna's, in the manner of a man who has spent his life reading the room and has finally read one wrong. Slay did 4 things in 8 days, and each of them was, on its face, entirely proper. He referred Captain Bray's report to the Board of Household Discipline, as the report itself discloses a prima facie breach of a standing order. That was true. He informed the board that the guardsman's account rests upon a conversation with a member of the royal family aged 9 years, who cannot be examined, and whose evidence, if any, must be taken with the greatest care and the least possible distress. That was also true, and it was the sentence that nearly finished us, because it sounded like tenderness and was a wall. He requested from the office of the Queen's papers the production of the item deposited on the 14th instant for examination by the household's own examiner, the said item being, on its face, a document of the late Queen and therefore Crown property. And when Ivan Sedge refused, as she was entitled to, as she had refused a controller twice before in 19 years, he did not fight her. He simply had the King's private secretary put the request in front of the King, in a folder of 11 other papers. On the morning the King came back exhausted from the naval yards, and the King, who had signed 900 things that month, and who wanted more than anything in the world not to have another conversation about his dead wife's estate, signed it. And fourth, he wrote to my father. That letter I have read too. It is a masterpiece of its horrible kind. It expressed the controller's concern for Her Highness the Princess Maelin, who had been the object of an irregular approach by a member of the household guard at a closed post, who appeared to be under a degree of strain, and whose account of recent events was not consistent in all particulars. It suggested, with enormous delicacy, that the child might be spared the atmosphere of the palace during the inquiry, perhaps a few months at the coast, with Her Highness's own family, away from all of it. Away from all of it, meaning away from here, meaning out of reach of anyone who might ever hear her speak. My father is Crown Prince Rowan, and he was at that moment 900 miles away on the Valemark coast with my mother, opening a dock and standing on a great many quaysides, and he received that letter on a Tuesday and was on a train by Tuesday night. I want to be honest about my father because the histories are kind to him and he does not deserve all of it. He was not there. For 11 days, while all of this was done to me, my father was making speeches, and I do not blame him for that. A crown prince goes where he is sent, but I was 9, and I had told the truth, and the truth had made the whole palace go strange, and my father was not in it. And then he was. He came into my room at 6:30 in the morning with his coat still on and the reins still on his shoulders, and he sat down on the floor, a grown man on the floor, in front of a 9-year-old, and he said, "Tell me all of it, and I will not say a single word until you have finished, and I will not ask you to say it twice." And I told him, and he did not say a single word until I had finished. And when I had finished, he put his face in his hands for a moment, and then he got up and went out, and I heard him going down the corridor, and I have never in my life heard a man walk like that. My mother, Princess Alara, came in a minute later and got into the bed with me with her boots on, which she was not supposed to do, and stayed until I slept. I say all this so you know that from the 12th day onwards I was not alone. That matters. Everything that happened afterwards happened to a child who had a father and a mother standing in front of her, and who was believed, and who was told so every day, and who was never once asked to prove anything to anybody again. Whatever else this story contains, it does not contain a lonely child. It contains a lonely soldier. because they had already taken Merrick Dunne apart. The Board of Household Discipline sat on the 19th. It was not a court. It was 3 officers and a secretary in a paneled room, and its business was whether a guardsman had broken a standing order, and the answer to that was yes, plainly, and he had said so himself in writing on the day it happened. They did not permit the substance. They said, and there is a certain terrible logic in it, that the question of whether a document in the custody of the Queen's papers was genuine or false was a matter for the justiciar and not for a disciplinary board of the household guard, and that Guardsman Dunne's asterisk motive for breaking the order was neither here nor there. A soldier does not get to choose which orders are important. Captain Bray gave evidence for him and was told twice to confine himself to the facts. Sergeant Nan Orick gave evidence and was asked whether she had heard the guardsman speak first, and said yes, and was asked whether she had heard the princess's exact words, and said she had heard the last of them, and was asked whether she could swear that the guardsman had not put those words into the child's mouth before she came within hearing, and she stood there for a long moment and said, "No, sir, I cannot swear to what I did not hear," which was the honest answer, and it cost us dearly, and I have never held it against her for 1 second, and neither did he. And Merrick Dunne, asked whether he had anything to say, said the thing that got into the newspapers. They found the charge proved. They could hardly do otherwise. He was suspended from duty, and he surrendered his colors, and he handed in his bearskin and his rifle, and the belt he had earned at 19, and he walked out of Harrogate in a plain coat on a wet Thursday with his kit in a bag, and went to a lodging house on Candle Street with 3 weeks' pay. He was 29. He had been a soldier for 10 years. He had asked one question. And the machine, having ground out the grit, went smoothly on. Now I must tell you about the midpoint of the thing, the moment when I stopped being the person who had exposed the scheme and became, without moving a muscle, the person who proved it. Dr. Peveril Grange was the household's examiner of documents. He had held the post for 22 years. He had a small dry practice in the city and a large reputation, and as we learned much later, 410 crowns of debt at the Elmgate tables, which is not a great deal of money to a man like Slay, and is a very great deal of money to a man like Grange. The king's signature had released the letter from the paper's office for examination. Mistress Sedge fought it to the last inch. She insisted the examination be conducted in her office, under her eye, with the document never leaving the counter, and she got that much, and it is the only reason we still had a document at all. But she could not stop the examination, and she could not choose the examiner. Grange took 2 days. And on the 3rd he produced a report which said, in 11 paragraphs of beautiful, sober, technical prose, that the letter was genuine. The paper was the late Queen's, the Wheatsheaf watermark of the Valemark mill she had used all her life, and which had ceased production 9 years before, so it could not have been bought. Correct. It was genuine paper. They had cut it from the blank end leaves of one of her own account books, which Slay had access to, and which nobody thought to check for 11 months. The ink matched the ink in her Standish. Correct. It was her ink. Perrin Gost had been given a bottle of it. The hand, and here Grange went on for 4 paragraphs, displayed all the idiosyncrasies of the late Queen's mature script, including the open descender of the letter G, the unlooped H, and the characteristic rising baseline of her later years. Correct. Perrin Gost had spent 11 weeks and been paid 2,000 crowns, and he was the best engraver the Royal Mint had ever dismissed for dishonesty, and he was very, very good. And the seal Grange saved this for last, and it is the paragraph that makes me feel ill even now. The seal was impressed with the late Queen's own private matrix, and the impression was fresh, and it had been made, according to the ledger of the Queen's papers itself, by Her Highness the Princess Maelin, in the presence of the Queen Consort, and afterwards deposited by Her Highness with this office. Do you see it? They took the truth. They took the whole, entire, unedited truth, every word of which I had told freely to a guardsman and a sergeant and a keeper and my father, and every word of which was written down in Ivan Sedge's numbered ledger in 5 different hands, and they turned it, without altering a syllable, into the strongest possible authentication of the forgery. The child found the letter. The child sealed it with her grandmother's own seal, as her grandmother would have. The child carried it of her own accord to the office of the Queen's papers and deposited it there. Who could ask for a better provenance? What forger in the world builds a plot that ends with the document being handed across a counter by the very person it disinherits? Sleigh's covering minute made exactly that point, in exactly that tone of gentle, wondering reasonableness, and it is the single cleverest thing I have ever seen a wicked man do. And the rest of it, the wren, the asterisk put it in her box and find it on Remembrance Day, the never say where it came from was, said the minute, the recollection of a distressed child of 9, which the household does not doubt was honestly given, but which cannot stand against the physical evidence, and which was in any event first put into words not by the child but by a guardsman who has since been found to have broken his orders in order to obtain it. There it was, the whole architecture. My honesty was the mortar, Dunne's disgrace was the proof I had been coached, and my grandmother's own seal, pressed by my own hand, was the keystone. The remembrance of Queen Isolde was in 12 days. The letter would be read aloud in the Rose study, before the king and the family and the court, in the presence of the justiciar's clerk. And on the strength of it, and of Grange's report, and of the king's grief, a minute would be laid before the court of the justiciar praying that the Isolde settlement be set aside as having been made in error and repented of, and that the estate Larkspur, the Beech Avenue, the 40,000 books, the jewels, the Valemark income, be returned to the crown's discretion. And the king's discretion, that autumn, wore violet and had a hand warm on his shoulder. I found out on the 24th, because my father, white with rage, told me. He told me because he had decided, standing in the rain on a station platform 11 days earlier, that he would never in his life do to his daughter what had been done to Aude Dunne, and that whatever else she lost, she would not lose the right to know what was being done in her name. I said, but it hasn't got the bird. And my father, Crown Prince Rowan, heir to Eldermore, who had spent 5 days beating on every door in that palace, sat down on the edge of my bed and said, very quietly, I know, my love, and I cannot make one single person in this house care. There were, at that point, 4 people left standing between Morwenna and everything she wanted, and Halbert Sleigh took 3 of them off the board in a single week. Captain Ansel Bray was posted to the depot at Coldhaven, on the far northern coast, to take charge of stores. It was not a punishment, it was a posting. It was in the Gazette with 11 other postings, and it was effective in 6 days, and the depot at Coldhaven has a garrison of 40 men, and has never in its history been commanded by a serving captain of the household guard. Bray packed his house. He had a wife and 2 boys and a career that had just ended, and he did not complain to anybody. And on the night before he left, he wrote a letter and posted it to a lodging house on Candle Street. Sergeant Nan Orick was not posted anywhere. She was simply, quietly, taken off every duty that put her within 100 yards of the family, and given nights, and given gates, and given the long cold walls, which is how a regiment tells a soldier that she is finished without ever having to write it down. And on the 2nd of Ashmonth, the office of the Queen's papers was sealed. The minute was 2 sentences long. Given that the item deposited on the 14th of Reapmonth was now the subject of a prospective proceeding before the court of the justiciar, and given that questions had been raised touching the regularity of the office's handling of that item, the office of the Queen's papers would be closed, its records placed under seal, and its keeper relieved of her duties on full pay pending the conclusion of the matter. Questions had been raised touching the regularity of the office's handling. By whom? By the controller of the household. What questions? The minute did not say, and no one asked, because it was the 2nd of Ash month and there was a remembrance to prepare. Isolde Sedge was 61 years old and had served the Queens of Eldermore for 19 years, and she was walked out of her own office by 2 men from the controller's staff at 4 in the afternoon, while a locksmith worked on the door behind her. She had in her hand nothing. They had made sure of that. She had asked to take her spectacle case and been permitted. She had asked to take the day book and been refused. And behind that lead seal, in a black oak cabinet, in a bound ledger with numbered pages, lay a requisition dated the 2nd of Reap month, issuing the private seal matrix of the late Queen Isolde out of the custody of this office for the purpose of comparison in connection with the household inventory. Signed in the long gray copperplate hand of Halbert Slay, controller of the household, and never in 6 weeks returned. That was why the office was sealed. That was the only reason the office was sealed, and it took us until the very last hour to be able to say so. I have called this the false dawn because that is what the soldiers call it, but there was nothing false about it. It was simply the dark. On the 2nd of Ash month, we had a forged letter that the Crown's own examiner had certified genuine, a disgraced guardsman in a lodging house, a captain going to Coldhaven, a sergeant walking walls at night, a keeper on gardening leave in a cottage 40 miles away, a king who would not hear his own son on the subject of his own wife, and 18 days to the remembrance, and a 9-year-old who kept saying, to anybody who would listen, that it hadn't got the bird. Merrick Dunne opened Bray's letter on the 3rd of Ash month, sitting on the end of a bed in a lodging house on Candle Street, in a room with a jug and a basin, and a window that looked at a brick wall. It contained no advice, no comfort, and no complaint. It contained a single sheet, copied out in Bray's square hand, of standing orders of the Household Guard of Eldermore, Part 4, Section 9, of the color muster, and 1 line at the bottom. It is still in A.B. Section 9 is very old. It survives because nobody has ever quite dared to strike it out. It provides that at the color muster, held annually in the presence of the sovereign and of the colonel-in-chief, upon the day appointed, any man born upon the regiment's roll may claim the word of the post, the right to be heard, once in the sovereign's presence, without leave of any officer, for so long as it takes the color to be lowered and cased. It has conditions. He must be born on the roll, and a man under suspension is still born on the roll, because suspension is not discharge, and that is the crack in the wall that Bray had spent 3 nights finding. He must come in the order of his rank and be perfect in his turnout, which meant colors he no longer possessed. He must claim it in his own person in the open, before the color is lowered. And there is a last line, which has hung over the household guard for 240 years, and which Bray had underlined once in ink. And if what he says be found false, or frivolous, or spoken for his own advantage, he shall be discharged with ignominy, and his name struck from the roll, and no man of the regiment shall speak it again. Not dismissed, struck, not sacked, erased. The regiment would not merely put him out, it would agree formally to forget him. The color muster is held on the day of the remembrance of Queen Isolde, because Isolde had been colonel-in-chief of the household guard for 26 years, and had loved them, and had once stood 4 hours in sleet at a review rather than sit down before the men did. 18 days. He had a right to speak and nothing to say. So he went to Larkspur. He walked most of it. He had 3 weeks' pay and no rail warrant, and he was not going to spend money he might need on a train, and it is 61 miles from the city to Larkspur along the river road, and he did it in 3 days in a plain coat with his kit on his back, and he arrived at the lodge gates on the 6th of Ash month in the rain, looking, as she told me afterwards, like something the beach avenue had spat out. He went to Larkspur because of 1 sentence I had said to him in the West Gallery, and because he was a man who counted things. It hasn't got the bird. He did not know what the bird was. I had not explained it, I had been 9 and in a hurry, and it had never once occurred to me that anybody in the world did not know about the wren. And nobody in the palace could tell him, because nobody in the palace had ever received a letter from my grandmother. But somebody had received 4,000 of them. Mrs. Tamsin Reese had been Queen Isolde's companion for 31 years. She had come from the Valemark coast with her in the first place, a girl of 19 with a Valemark accent and no money, and she had stayed, and she had opened her post, and written her letters, and held her hand, and closed her eyes. And when it was over she had refused a pension and a cottage in the town and had asked instead for the lodge at Larkspur, because the beach avenue was where the Queen had been happiest, and she did not intend to be anywhere else. She was 73. She gave him tea, and looked at his boots, and made him take them off, and then she listened to him for an hour and 10 minutes without saying anything at all. Then she got up and went to a cupboard, and came back with a bundle of letters tied with tape, and put one into his hands. It was a letter from a grandmother to a small girl about a dog that had eaten a hat. At the bottom, beside the signature, there was a little bird, 3 strokes, a body, a beak, a tail. She did that on every letter she ever wrote to a person she loved, said Mrs. Reese. Not on state papers, not on the household accounts, on letters, 50 years near enough. She learned it off her own grandmother in Valemark, where it means, well. It means this is really me. Merrick Dunne sat with the letter in his hands for a while. Then he said, Mrs. Reese, did anyone ever forge her hand? And the old woman put down her cup, and her face changed, and she said, Yes, and I have been waiting 11 years for somebody to come to this door and ask me that. Here is what happened 4 years before my grandmother died. A man had gone about the county with a letter of character purporting to be signed by the Queen, recommending him as a steward, and had got a place on the strength of it, and had robbed the place blind. It came out. The letter came back to Larkspur and was put in front of Isolde, and she looked at it for a long time and did not say a word, and then she said something that Tamsin Reese had never forgotten. It is not the money. It is that a piece of paper walked about the country in my voice, and I could not contradict it. That is what they will do to me when I am dead, Tamsin. They will put words in my mouth when my mouth is shut, and there will be no one to say it is not me. And then she said, well, I shall see to it. She went up to the palace the following month, to the office of the Queen's papers, and she stayed there an hour, and she came out looking pleased with herself in the particular way she had, and she said to Mrs. Reese in the carriage, It is done. Whatever they hold up after I am gone, there is now a thing in that office that will knock it flat. She never said what it was. She was like that. She enjoyed knowing things. Merrick Dunne stood up so fast he knocked the tea over. Mrs. Reese, he said, what month? Frost month, said Tamsin Reese. The 11th of Frost month. I know because it was my birthday and she made a joke of it. Everything the office of the Queen's papers receives is entered in the register, by date, in a bound ledger with numbered pages, and cannot be removed except by the hand that lodged it or by warrant of the sovereign. Isolde had lodged something on the 11th of Frost month, 11 years ago. She had never withdrawn it. It was in that office, behind a lead seal, on the authority of Halbert Sleigh. He walked back in 2 days. He did not go to Candle Street. He went filthy, unshaven, in a wet coat, with his boots gone at the heel, to Ashfield and stood at the gate and asked to see Princess Adela. They did not let him in. Of course they did not. He stood at that gate for 9 hours, from noon until 9 at night, at attention in the rain, because he did not know any other way to wait, and at 9 o'clock a window went up somewhere above him and a woman's voice said, "Oh, for God's sake, bring him in before he dies on my gravel." Princess Adela was the king's sister, and she was 60, and she had been colonel-in-chief of the household guard since the day my grandmother died, and she was the only person alive of whom Morwenna was frightened. She fed him, which he had not expected. She sat him in front of a fire in his stockinged feet with a plate on his knees, and she asked him nothing until he had finished it, and then she said, "Now." He talked for 2 hours. She did not interrupt once. When he had finished, she got up and walked about the room for a while, and then she said the thing I have had carved since on the plinth of nothing at all, because she would have hated that, but which I have kept in my head for 21 years. Guardsman, there are 900 people in that palace who have known for 3 weeks that something is wrong. Every one of them has decided that it is not their business, or not their rank, or not the moment. You were the only one whose business it definitely was not. She stopped in front of him. "What do you want from me? And be careful, because I will give you exactly what you ask for and not one thing more." He said, "Ma'am, I want my colors back for one day, and I want to be at the color muster, and I want to claim the word of the post. You understand what happens if you are wrong?" "Yes, ma'am." "You will be struck, not dismissed, struck. Your mother's name goes with yours." There was a silence. "My mother's name," said Merrick Dunne, "was Isolde Dunne, and she was turned out of a house for a silver dish she never took, and there is not a piece of paper anywhere in this realm with her name written properly on it. So I do not think, ma'am, that I have as much to lose in that direction as you suppose." Princess Adela looked at him for a long moment. Then she rang the bell and said to the man who came, "Send to the adjutant. Guardsman Merrick Dunne of the 2nd Company is restored to duty for the day of the color muster on the authority of the Colonel-in-Chief, and his colors are to be at Ashfield by Thursday, and if the Controller's office has anything to say about it, they may say it to me." Then she turned back to him. "I will get you through the gate," she said. "I will not get you out again. Whatever you mean to say in front of my brother, you will say on your own 2 feet with your own mouth, and if it is not true, I will strike you myself. Do you have proof?" "No, ma'am." "What do you have?" "A date," said Dunne, "and a girl who told the truth." 11 days. Princess Adela spent them the way a professional spends the time before a thing that cannot be rehearsed. She sent a carriage 40 miles and brought Ivan Sedge to Ashfield, and Mistress Sedge sat at her table and wrote out from memory the whole anatomy of the office she had been walked out of. Which cabinet, which shelf, which key. 19 years. She could have drawn it in the dark. She sent for my father, who came and stayed an hour, and went back and refused in writing, over his own signature, to let me be taken to the coast. She did not send for me. If Morwenna had been able to say that the Colonel-in-Chief had had the child in her house for a week before the muster, the whole thing would have been asterisk coaching, and coaching was the word that had been doing all the work. Halbert Slay's last move was the order of ceremonies for the 20th of Ashmonth, the remembrance of Queen Isolde in the Rose Study at 10, the color muster at noon, and the minute in the matter of the Isolde Settlement laid before the court of the justiciar at 4 o'clock that afternoon. 10, noon, 4. He had put the reading in front of the muster and the justiciar behind it because he did not like loose ends, and because he had begun, I am sure of it, to be afraid. We went up to the Rose Study at 10. The fire laid and not lit, the book face down with her place in it, my grandfather at the window with the river light on him. Then the controller came forward with a folder, said that this year the office had a heavier duty, and read the letter aloud. He read it beautifully, and he did not hurry it. He read the small joke about the beach avenue, and there was a sound in that room like a room breathing out. He read the part about a girl of 9 who should not be made the richest woman in Eldermore. My grandfather put his hand flat on the table. He was 71. He had been married to her for 41 years, and he was standing in her room in front of her chair and her cold grate, and he had to be helped into a seat. And it was Morwenna who helped him, and she did that beautifully too. And I said it, out loud, in front of the whole court, in a voice that I am told came out as a sort of squeak. "It hasn't got the bird." Morwenna turned and looked down at me with such open, unhurried, motherly warmth and said, "I know, my love." 3 words, they finished me, because I know, my love, is what you say to a child who is telling you a dream. Anselm Varro, clerk of the court of the justiciar, wrote the time in the margin of his brief, 10:41. And on the landing outside, while the court filed past us, my father crouched down and held my face in both his hands. "You have not done one wrong thing, not one. Whatever happens at 4 o'clock today, you will not carry 1 ounce of it, and I forbid you to try." I did not believe him. It took about 6 years. But he said it while there was still time for it to count, and that is the whole difference between a father and a bystander. At noon, 1,100 men stood in line on the great gravel for the color muster, the colonel-in-chief mounted, the sovereign in a chair under an awning. And out on the left flank of the 2nd Company, 1 pace behind the last man of his rank, in another man's tunic, a bearskin signed out of the spares for cleaning, a captain's white gloves posted down from Coldhaven, and his own belt, which had lain 31 days at the bottom of Nan Orick's locker since she bought it back off the store sergeant with 3 weeks of her own pay, stood Guardsman Merrick Dunne. The king saw him. I watched my grandfather see him. Slay saw him too, and sent word to the king's private secretary. And Princess Adela said, without turning her head, in a voice pitched for a parade ground and not a conversation, "He is born upon my roll. Take your hand off my color party." They lowered the color at 11 minutes past 12. And Merrick Dunne stepped out 3 paces, grounded his rifle, and said, in a voice that carried the length of that gravel and did not shake, Part 4, Section 9, "I claim the word of the post." The silk stopped halfway down. The adjutant turned his head towards the colonel-in-chief, and the colonel-in-chief said 1 word. "Granted." He had, by the letter of the order, as long as it takes to lower and case a color, about 90 seconds, done properly. Nan Orick was in the color party that day, and she has never once admitted that she cased that color slowly. She simply looks at you. What he said is short, and I have it exactly because Varro wrote it down. "Sir, on the 11th of Frost month, 11 years ago, Her Majesty Queen Isolde went to the office of the Queen's papers and lodged something in the register, and she never took it out again. It is in that office now. That office was sealed 9 days ago on the order of the controller of your household, and by the standing order of this realm nothing comes out from behind that seal except upon a warrant of the sovereign. I have no proof of anything, sir. I broke an order, I was found to have broken it, and I make no complaint of that, and I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to believe her. Break the seal, read what your wife left there. And if it is nothing, then I am a liar in front of 1,100 men, and my name comes off the roll this afternoon, and I will not say 1 word against it." Morwenna came forward and put her hand on my grandfather's shoulder, and she was magnificent. She said, gently, reasonably, with a small rueful laugh at the end of it, that of course the office should be opened, that she had nothing on earth to fear from it, and that it should be done properly at the justiciar's in the afternoon with the lawyers, and not on a parade ground by a soldier suspended for approaching a girl of 9 at a closed door. It was, in every particular, the right thing to say. She had a way of being right that took the air out of a room. And Princess Adela said, "The color is not yet cased." King Alaric got out of his chair. He did not look at Dunne. He did not look at his wife. He looked at nothing at all, over the bearskins of his own guard, with the face of a man being made to look at something he had been holding shut with both hands. Because he knew about the wren. Of course he knew. He had been married to her for 41 years, and every letter she ever sent him had a small bird beside the name. 3 strokes, a body, a beak, a tail. He had a box of them in his own room. He had, as it happens, read one of them that morning. And an hour and a half before, in her room, in front of her chair, he had been handed a letter from her with no bird on it, and he had put his hand flat on the table. He said to nobody, in an entirely ordinary voice, "There is no wren." And then to the adjutant, "Break the seal." Nobody stood the parade down. No one gave the order and no one asked for it. 1,100 men stood on that gravel in the cold for 51 minutes while a clerk of the justiciar, a locksmith and a 61-year-old woman in a black coat, whom Princess Adela had planted at the back of the spectators at 8 that morning, went into the North Tower. Ivan Sedge came back across the parade ground carrying two things. The first was a bound ledger, open at a page she had not needed to search for, on which was entered a requisition dated the 2nd of Reap month, issuing the private seal matrix of the late Queen Isolde out of the custody of that office for the purpose of comparison in connection with the household inventory, and signed in a long gray copperplate hand. The second was a canvas parcel, sewn at the seams and sealed with wax across them, docketed on the front in the hand of her predecessor. Lodged by Her Majesty Queen Isolde, 11 Frostmonth, not to be opened save by Her Majesty or by the Sovereign. And underneath that, in a sloping, hurrying hand I had known all my life, and I promise you with a small bird beside it. You will know when. It will be when they begin to quote me. Varro cut the seams in front of the king and 1,100 witnesses, and lifted out three things. A sheet of 41 signatures made on one afternoon, dated and witnessed by the keeper of the day and two clerks of the rolls. Isolde R. *, 41 times, and beside every one of them a wren. Her private seal matrix, the dark horn handle, the worn silver face lodged into that office, said the docket, and not to be issued out of it for any purpose without my hand or the king's. Not to be issued out of it. And in Ivan Sedge's other hand, 6 weeks old, over the controller's own signature, a requisition doing precisely that. And a declaration in her hand, witnessed by three, which Anselm Varro read aloud on a parade ground to a standing king. I, Isolde, Queen of Eldermore, being in my right mind and in no haste, make this declaration because a paper once walked about this realm speaking in my voice and I could not contradict it, and because when I am dead I shall not be able to contradict anything at all. Let it be known that upon every private paper of my own hand I set a wren beside my name, and have done so since I was a girl in Valemark. Any paper offered as mine, private in its nature, and not a paper of state which does not bear the wren, is not mine, whatever the paper, whatever the ink, whatever the hand, and whatever the seal. I have told this to no living person but my granddaughter Malin, who learned her letters at my table and who will one day be a girl worth robbing. A thing known to two is a secret. A thing known to three is a weapon, and will be used against me. I do not know who will need this. I know that somebody will. There is more of it. That is the part that matters. Halbert Slay did not run and did not shout. He said, I should like to sit down, and some guardsman fetched him a chair, which I have never quite forgiven the guardsman for, and he sat on it in front of the whole regiment with his hands on his knees until the justiciar's officers came for him at 2 o'clock. And Morwenna. I was 9 years old and I was watching her, and I want to tell you that she crumpled, and she did not. She stood perfectly still for what Varro's shorthand records as 11 seconds. Then she turned to my grandfather and began, in the warmest voice in the world, Alaric. And King Alaric, who had loved her, and who had signed 900 things that month, and who had not been able to hear his own son on the subject of his own wife, said, she used to say that nobody can copy a bird. It is the last thing he ever said to her in the 4 years that were left to him. The rest is law, and law is slow, and I will be quick. Perrin Gost turned Crown's evidence inside a week. 11 weeks' work, 2,000 crowns, paper cut from the blank-end leaves of my grandmother's own account books. Dr. Peveril Grange was struck off the roll of examiners. And Halbert Slay was convicted of forgery, of conspiracy to defraud, and of the fraudulent removal of a crown chattel from the office of the Queen's papers, which last carried the heaviest term of the three, and which is why he is the only man I have watched be destroyed by his own tidiness. He had signed for it. He signed for everything. Morwenna was tried in the spring in open court, and she was charming to the last day of it, and she admitted nothing, and she was convicted. The style and dignity of Queen Consort were taken from her by an instrument under my grandfather's hand and the Great Seal. She wrote to me twice from her confinement. I have never opened either letter. They are in my grandmother's writing box, in the rose study, where my grandfather ordered the fire lit that winter, and where it has been lit every winter since. The Isolde Settlement stood. It was never even argued. Ivan Sedge walked back into her unsealed office that afternoon and served 9 more years. Ansel Bray came back from Coldhaven inside 8 days and was a colonel before he was 50. Nan Orick was made color sergeant in the spring and carried the color at the next muster, and cased it that year, extremely briskly. And Merrick Dunne. Section 9 had a great deal to say about a man whose word of the post was found false, and not one syllable about a man whose word was found true, because in 240 years the question had never come up. Princess Adela wrote the new line herself, and it stands beneath the old one. And if what he says be found true, he shall be restored to his post, and the day shall be entered upon the regiment's roll, and no man of the regiment shall forget it. He got his colors back, and not for 1 day. He would not take a commission. He was offered one 3 times. He said that he was not an officer, he was a sentry, and he went back on the door of the rose study, which was open now, and had chairs that were sat in and a fire. There is one more piece of paper. When I was 18 and came into my grandmother's money, the first thing I did with it was to instruct 4 lawyers to open the matter of a silver dish that had gone missing from a great house in the northern shires 30 years before. The house's own books, which nobody had ever troubled to look at, showed it sold that February by the son of the house, to settle a debt at cards. A finding was entered at the county seat, in a bound register with numbered pages. It records that Aude Dunne, laundress of that parish, did not take the dish, that she was turned out without cause, and that the record stands corrected. Merrick Dunne was 38. He read it standing in a small brown office, with his hat in his hand, and he did not say one word, and neither did I. And afterwards we walked to the station in the rain, and he bought me a bun. There is now a piece of paper in this realm with her name written properly on it. That is the story. People ask me what changed everything, and they always want the answer to be the parcel, the declaration, the 41 wrens, the requisition book. It is a very good answer, and it is the wrong one. None of that existed on the 3rd morning. On the 3rd morning there was a girl of 9 with her hand going out towards a latch, and a soft folded letter, and a scheme so beautifully built that 4 lawyers and a household and a king would have swallowed it whole. In about 11 seconds I would have opened that door, and put the letter in the box, and gone on believing for the rest of my life that I had done a kind and secret thing for a woman who was kind to me. And a man who had been ordered not to speak came off a door, and went down on one knee so that his eyes were below mine, and asked me the smallest question in the world. "Is it yours, Highness?" Nobody ever asked Aude Dunne. Somebody asked me. That is the entire difference between the 2 stories. It is 4 words long, it costs nothing, and almost no one in this world ever spends it. I sign my letters still, the way she taught me at the long table with the nib that spat. A small bird beside the name, 3 strokes, a body and a beak and a tail, because anybody can copy a name. It means this is really me.